will not take us there.
Yes.
Actually, in a virtual world, yeah.
Hello everybody, can you hear me in the back? It's okay? I'll tell you what, before we start, as I turn my phone down to off, how about we all turn our phones down to off? Shall we start? Welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. My name is Kevin Clark, and our presentation is titled Staggered Tellings, Immediacy, Intimacy, and Ellipses in the Verse Novel. Before I introduce the august members of this panel, I thought I'd provide an overview on the subject, and then after each of the presenters speak about their respective books, we'll jump into a question and answer period. Verse narratives are as old as Gilgamesh, but with the 1831 publication of Alexander Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, the verse novel begins in earnest as something other than a verse epic, a mock epic, or a verse autobiography. A number of other English language verse novels were published in the 19th century, including Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh in 1857. The form lapsed in the first 3 quarters of the 20th century, but regained vitality in the 1980s with the publication of Rita Dove's Thomas and Beulah, Andrew Hudgens' After the Long War, and Derek Walcott's Omeros, among others. When I'm asked, what is a verse novel? And a lot of people say that to me. They say, I'm writing a verse. What is that, they say? I inevitably have to describe how it's different from a novel. A master of the obvious, as my mother always said about me. I say first, well, it's written in verse. It's poetry, not prose. And I soon add that most often it's composed of individual poems, not one novel-length poem. But the summary is insufficient. After all, poetry generally requires more attentive reading than prose. After finishing Larry Levis's last book, Elegy, a novel-reading friend of mine said recently, quote, "Poetry takes us to a different place, doesn't it? It changes the atmosphere in our heads. We have to give ourselves over so completely if we're going to get something out of it, especially when we read an entire book," unquote. She's correct, but we read most single-author volumes as miscellanies, poetry books that feature poems designed to stand on their own. The cumulative effect may be as my friend describes, but despite the fact that poets spend endless hours shuffling and reshuffling the order of their poems in order to create the subtlest, most expert presentation, we don't necessarily concentrate on the refined arc of the book's development. We are moved by the overall effect, and we concentrate on the poems we like, the ones we prefer. The overall effect of a verse novel requires that we acknowledge plot, although verse novels rarely sustain in the manner of a novel, which usually holds our attention in part by the arc of its external actions. With novels, we grant the language its due, but we usually want to know what's going to happen next. Robert Altman once described his witty, dialogue-heavy mystery movie, Gosford Park, as a who-cares-who-done-it Far more often than not, verse novels are usually not records of what happens in service of a traditional plot, but what happens in the interstices between dramatic events. In fact, we may even know all the dramatic events beforehand. That's why we've called this panel staggered tellings. Verse novels rarely privilege the linear sequence of incidents. They're more elliptical. A good verse novel applies the full power of poetic language to reveal the action and quick shifting dynamics of the interior life. We see into the minds of characters while they contend with the more public happenings. We become intimate with thought and expression in a way we rarely do in a traditional novel. To paraphrase what Stevens said of the long poem, we are more naturalized to the voice or voices of the verse novel. Yes, we have to pay close attention for a long period of time. No doubt this requirement is the reason we have relatively few verse novels. Not only does it take commitment from a publisher and a reader, but it takes unusually long commitment on the part of a poet to write a novel's length of poetry. Maybe we'll hear tonight how long it took our fellow writers here. Especially since we have to maintain at all points the same degree of aesthetic intensity as one would apply to individual poems in an ordinary volume. But, as anyone who has read the verse novels of the three writers on this panel will attest, the effort can definitely be worthwhile. Let me introduce the poets in alphabetical order. Wendy Barker is the author of 5 full-length collections of poetry. She has also published 3 chapbooks and a selection of poems with accompanying essays. Her co-translations of Tagore's final poems appeared in 2001. Recipient of NEA, Rockefeller, and Fulbright fellowships, she is the poet in residence at the University of Texas, San Antonio. Wendy's verse novel, Nothing Between Us, The Berkeley Years, narrates an interracial love affair that takes place in Berkeley, California during the 60s. Raw, political, epiphanic, highly textured, and deeply introspective. Nothing Between Us has a single narrator who tells the story entirely in prose poems, each of which stands on its own. Rita Dove is winner of the Pulitzer Prize and the Duke Ellington Lifetime Achievement Award, as well as the Fulbright Lifetime Achievement Medal. She holds the chair of Commonwealth Professor of English at the University of Virginia. President Obama presented her with the 2011 National Medal of Arts. She is the author of 2 verse novels, Thomas and Beulah in 1986 and Sonata Melodica in 2009. Modeled on the author's grandparents, the groundbreaking Thomas and Beulah renders the lives of a married African-American couple from the early part of the century until their deaths in the 1960s. 2 separate sequences offer 2 views of the couple's lives, the first giving Thomas's side and the second giving Beulah's. Sonata Melodica focuses on the true life story of the mixed-race violinist wunderkind, George Polgreen Bridgetower. Euphonious and daring in its form, the book employs numerous voices and devices, and even a short verse play to render Bridgetower's life, especially in relation to his father, his lovers, and especially then Ludwig van Beethoven. Kevin Young is the author of 7 poetry books and winner of the Patterson Poetry Prize. A finalist for the National Book Award, he's the Haygood Professor of Creative Writing and Curator of Literary Collections and the Danowski Poetry Library at Emory University. His book, The Gray Album, on the Blackness of Blackness, won the Grey Wolf Press Nonfiction Prize. In 2005, he published his widely read verse novel, Black Mariah, which mimics film noir. In fact, the cover tells us that the book is, quote, produced and directed by Kevin Young. told almost entirely in short free-verse couplets over the course of 5 chapters and more than 80 poems, Black Maria is seemingly effortless reworking of the language of film noir. Kevin and I just had a little exchange here. He's also the author of Ardency, A-R-D-E-N-C-Y, another remarkable volume, published in 2011. Is it a verse novel? Well, for the sake of argument, I'll say yes, and we'll hear Kevin say what he says. That tells the sweeping story of the slaves who mutinied aboard the Amistad and who were soon captured and imprisoned in Connecticut. Employing epistolary forms, diaries, even a libretto, and other forms, the book chronicles the interior lives of the Amistad survivors, as well as the abolitionists who helped them gain freedom and return to Africa. I believe books by all the writers here are, let's see, by Rita and Kevin are in the book fair. You can get their books. Wendy has books with her and is certainly willing to sell you and sign her books. So let's hear it for Wendy Barker.
Thank you, Kevin. It's such an honor to be on this panel this afternoon, especially with Rita Dove and Kevin Young, whose works I've admired for so long. It's a real honor to be with you both. And Kevin, thank you so much for arranging this terrific panel with such a fascinating subject. Whereas Rita's and Kevin's work, I know, has involved enormous amounts of research, my novel and prose poems involved not so much research as it did unlocking a box of memories that I had closed for a very, very long time. It was in 1994, I was lucky enough to have a Bellagio Rockefeller Foundation residency fellowship. It was at Bellagio that I began to sort of remember events from the 1960s, late 60s and early 70s. When I had moved from Phoenix, Arizona, you could tell by my coloring, my hair was blonde rather than white or whatever it is now, but I had moved from Phoenix, from a primarily white community, to Berkeley in the late 60s, and was given a job teaching at West Campus, which I think has been closed actually, but at that time was located in West Berkeley in what was then and primarily African-American neighborhood. Back at Bellagio in 1994, I was talking with a very distinguished economist after dinner one night. We had been having a discussion about political poetry, what poetry could do in terms of political poetry, what it couldn't do, and the conversation sort of kept going between Pierre and me. Other people drifted off, and somehow I found myself, I don't know why, he seemed sort of avuncular, kindly, fatherly, I don't know, sharing with him a little bit about my experiences in Berkeley, teaching at West Campus. And he was listening, and finally he said, "You've got to write about this. You've got to write about the subject." And I said, no, I can't. I can't write about this. The subject is too politically incorrect. Besides, I've got a husband whose feelings to consider, and I can't do this. Part of what I had shared with him was that not only was I, Missy Ann, suddenly transported into a very different world, but that during the course of my teaching, I had become involved in a very intense, very deep love relationship with an African-American colleague. I was married at the time. And somehow or another, I felt this confidence in trusting Pierre with his story, and said, I can't do this, you know, I've got a husband I've got to consider. And Pierre said, and I quote, he said, "Oh, hang husbands," he said. "When have male artists ever considered the feelings of the women in their lives? You've got to write about this." And so I thought, sort of as daddy had given me permission, you know. And the next morning, I went to my little study, and I carved out, carved is wrong, because it just flooded out. What became the last prose poem of the book just got written suddenly. And that last prose poem is really a summation of the entire, what we're calling a novel in verse, which is really kind of a disguised memoir in a way. It was 1968 when I moved to Berkeley. I was in my 20s. West Campus was not only in and primarily African-American neighborhood, but it was in a neighborhood just a couple of blocks away from Huey Newton and Bobby Seale's newly formed Black Panthers National Headquarters. In September, Newton had just been convicted of manslaughter. People were furious, enraged. Free Huey signs and graffiti were everywhere. It was an explosive year all over the planet, actually. And in our country, with the assassinations of Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, the Tet Offensive, the My Lai Massacre, 1968 has been called the year of rage, and that was the year that I moved to Berkeley. At West Campus, I found myself being called motherfucking honky bitch. In fact, an experience that stayed with me enough that sometimes when I felt there's a particularly raunchy kind of class, a lower division intro poetry class, there are times I've even said in class, you can call me Dr. Barker, you can call me Professor Barker, I prefer that you call me Wendy, but frankly, as long as you don't call me motherfucking honky bitch, I'm good. So I started writing, and I couldn't stop. It was just a flood of poems coming. It was as if I'd finally unlocked that box of memories that I had closed, and the poems just came and came and came. Events in the present fed the writing. Eating eggplant at a Chinese restaurant with a friend would get a poem coming. Beating egg whites for a souffle, somebody mentioning a line from Bob Dylan. All these worked their way into poems about the love relationship, but also not just about that, but about the realities of teaching, Many of whom were brilliant, many of whom were gifted, many of whom were absolutely just dolls to deal with. And then there were the times when, I kid you not, the pimps crawled in through the windows on University and Bonar and tried to actually yank their girls out working the street. So it was this wild spectrum of incredibly wide range of students. And I started writing about the kids and colleagues, about the classroom. All these things shredded their way into the book. Things happening in Berkeley, People's Park. And the poems just came, so everything fed them. Let me read the first one. Here's the first poem in the book. The one that begins. It's called Teaching Uncle Tom's Children. And you probably know that Uncle Tom's Children is the title of Richard Wright's collection of short stories. In this prose poem, I also refer to the title of Dick Gregory's autobiography, which is Nigger. And I also refer to Richard Wright's Native Son and Black Boy. Here is the first poem in Nothing Between Us, Teaching Uncle Tom's Children. He was the only other honky in the room, but wasn't. Blonde, natural. Was his mother or his dad, white or black? Kid played the best sax in town and only 14. Sax so sweet and cool, the moon rose cream over the hills and stars broke the fog. He didn't talk much. Neither did I, that first blacklit class any of us taught. I didn't know what to put on the board. Erased everything I'd written before, but the erasers were full of dust from the chalk. The blackboard turned powdery, a blur, clouded. We moved on through Nigger, Black Boy, Native Son. Not a kid caused trouble. Small sounds, fingers flipping the white pages of the paperbacks I collected and stacked in the corner cupboard after class. Slap of gum stretching in and out of a mouth. Hard sole of a shoe on the floor, scraping the surface, an emery board. And the train, track barely a block away. The train running the whole length of the San Francisco Bay. Crime moving ahead of it, toward us, that wail. So why prose poems? I had been writing them for about a year before going to Bellagio. I'd been captivated by Italo Calvino's cosmic comics, which aren't really prose poems, they're called short stories. We might call them flash fiction now. But I just adored that book, and I kept reading it. And of course, I'd also been influenced by Neruda and Merwin and Bly. And so, because I've been writing prose poems, which didn't work, they were all deep-sixed. But it's something about the form of the prose poem, which depends for its rhythm, not on the line break, but on the rhythm of the sentence. So there isn't that pause at the end of the line. They keep going with the rhythm of the sentence. Something about that just seemed to work. And as the poems multiplied, gradually I began to see a narrative emerging. At first, I don't think I even realized that in the last poem of the book, after I kind of summed up the whole novel, if you will. But gradually the narrative pattern emerged. And then after a couple of years, I started playing with ordering. And as I did that, I could see there were characters I needed to add, characters I could combine. I started changing names. I started seeing metaphoric patterns emerging. During those years, I had been very involved in fabric art. I came real close to getting an MFA in fabric art. I was a weaver for a long time. And the weaving is a huge metaphor in the book, weaving on all kinds of metaphoric levels, weaving threads of all different kinds together. And as I began to see that, began to generate more poems that would fit developing that series of extended metaphors. And then I also began to see that I could fictionalize by changing names, by changing details here and there. At first, this book started out in third person. She did this, she did that. But a couple of trusted readers said, it's got to be direct. You've got to have it be first person. So I changed it into first person. I finished writing all the poems and Nothing Between Us in 1998. The book took 10 years to find a publisher. I had 3 agents who took it on. They loved it. They said, oh, we're going to, it's going to be great. Nobody would touch it. It came as a finalist at a lot of contests. Editors wrote nice notes on a number of occasions. We loved it, but it's not really poems, they said, and it's too short for a novel. So it fell between the cracks. I also think, frankly, the subject matter was something nobody wanted to touch with a 30-foot pole. It was just a little bit too, we don't want to go there. That's my hunch. Finally, in 2008 or 9, I forget which, it was Martha Rhodes who chose the manuscript as runner-up for the Del Sol contest, and Michael Neff published it with Del Sol Press at the end of December of 2009, and I will always be grateful to them both. When the book came out, and I began to do readings across the country, in San Antonio at first, I was just terribly, terribly nervous. I had stomach-turning fears about the reception. I'm still nervous talking about it. It's still a subject that, it's a touchy subject. It's a difficult subject. And I think maybe that's one reason that the prose poem form worked, that the verse novel form worked, because it could come out in these little bits. It's not a straight, clear, linear story. It's filled with ambiguities and complexities and frustrations. And so I think that's one reason that that form worked very well. And perhaps now, in terms of the subject matter, writing about race, perhaps now, with more people of the pink persuasion or more white women, like Martha Collins, her wonderful work with Blue Front and White Papers, maybe now with more white writers acknowledging the complexities, the variations, the nuances of the multiracial world we all inhabit, maybe Nothing Between Us will not seem so radical after all, I hope. So thank you very much.
Rita Dove.
It's great to see all of you here, and I really, when I saw the title of the panel that Kevin was suggesting, I leapt right on that bandwagon, because I really think it's a fascinating development in all of our writing right now, this blur between whether something is prose or poetry. And as the title of this panel, as far as it's concerned, I think I've had quite a bit of a history with the left-hand side of the margin, the staggered tellings part, because as Kevin noted, Thomas and Beulah could, I guess, be called a verse novel, and as he said, it tells two sides of a story, two sides of a marriage. Mother Love is another book that of mine, which is a sequence, and I don't try to categorize these things, but in a certain way, it's not a novel because it doesn't have a plot, but the plot is based on the myth of Persephone and Demeter, and that's a huge, I guess, cycle, mostly sonnets or sonnet extensions, I guess you could call them, that revolve around that myth. And then I think really though, I'd like to concentrate my remarks on Sonata Melodica, because it, though I prefer, I guess, the term extended sequence, I don't know if there's any good name for any of this, you know, which is kind of wonderful. I kind of like the fact we can't label these things, but I guess as a verse novel, it maintains a forward compulsion. There is a story. It is the story of the life of this mixed-race violinist, and but it's also an excavation, I guess you could say, of that life, more than wanting to know what the plot is like. Because we know the plot. The plot I can tell you in about 1 minute. George Polgrim Bridgetower was born of a man who called himself an African prince, and a mother who was probably from today's Poland in the 18th century, 1780 or so. And somehow the only reason we know him is because Beethoven dedicated the Kreutzer Sonata to him, and in fact he premiered it. So he wrote it for him, he played it, and then somehow that sonata became known as the Kreutzer, and he disappeared from history. So that's the point that he surfaces as a human being on the tallies of our great human chronicles, and that's the point where he also disappears, and that's the point where I entered into the book. So I'd like to concentrate on this book because even though I think though I'm certainly will welcome questions or anything else, the narrative arc worked differently in each of those 3 books, but Sonata Melodica really applies most to that right-hand side of that column, you know, the immediacy, intimacy, and ellipses in the verse novel. Is it a verse novel? Well, you know, unlike Thomas and Beulah, it does have a definite sense of rising action, climax, denouement. There are even epilogues and prologues, because I do, on the surface, it looks like that the book traces a life from birth to death and then beyond. So what distinguishes that from biography or from, you know, a mere novel broken into poetic books? And as Kevin rightly intimated in his introduction, the angle of vision and the disregard for the plot, even as it happens, is one of the things that I think is essential for any kind of verse novel. That is, it's a sense that the narrative is a consequence of the lyric moment, you know, and that a radical, deeply poetic attention is paid to the soul's utterance, which is kind of translated into language and all of its attendant mistresses, I can say. When I try to go back and remember how I entered into this book, I realized that I was fascinated by the bare-bone facts, and I'm a cellist, or had been a cellist, let's put it that way. I've always been involved in music, so I didn't know Bridgetower's name, but it had disappeared in the stuff that you learn in about, you know, 8th grade. And it's stuff that's still with you, but you can't remember it. And I was sitting with my husband, and we were watching a biopic, just we'd gotten it, you know, out of, rented it, and it was on Beethoven. And in one scene, and they had done their work very well, their research very well, in one scene, Beethoven, who's going deaf but didn't want to let anyone know it, walked through a room of musicians and went to a back room to lay his head on the piano to feel it. As he walked through the room, there was one black violinist in this scene in the movie. And we kind of looked at each other like, what the, I mean, where'd he come from? And so it really nagged at me. It just couldn't let me go. And I think that's the way I begin any poem I've written. It wouldn't let me go. And this was the beginning ages, I mean, of really using the internet. I Googled black violinist Beethoven. That's all I could do. And I came up with one paragraph on Google from the British Museum, I think, which just simply said that this man had lived and died and that the Kreutzer Sonata was actually his. And the reason why Beethoven destroyed the dedication was because of supposedly a saucy comment that Rita Tower had made about a girl. Now, that's all we knew. And that's all I know. It was a brief moment. For me, I did not sit down and say, I'm going to write a book about this. It was not my intention. I just wanted to find out more about this event. And so I began doing research, but I was doing research not knowing what I was going to do with it. And as I read more and more, I thought maybe I'll write a poem about Bridge Tower because I wanted to reclaim him. But on the other hand, I didn't want to be what I kind of call a historical tourist, you know, just someone who goes and then snaps up an interesting moment in history and writes about it. That was not what I wanted to do. So what did I want to do? I mean, how was I going to work at this thing? I didn't outline anything. I write wildly out of order. Even within a single poem, I will sometimes start in the middle and work outward or backwards or forwards. I don't know why that works that way. But I had a lot of notes. I had found out a little bit more. It was really exciting. I found an article in this early 20th century, 1908 I think it was, article in the Musical Quarterly that simply mentioned Bridge Tower and mentioned that they used to go out for beers together, he and Beethoven, before they broke up their relationship. And so I was able to narrow that down. I read all of Beethoven's letters and his notes. And because my husband is German, so we've been to Germany, and I know German, so I was reading these things. And I found little teeny incidents, a little note from Beethoven that said, hey, let's go get a beer. To Bridge Tower, they knew each other about 3 months. I thought this relationship was deeper than I thought. So all of these things were working at me, and then I realized it's similar to Wendy, you know, sometimes it takes one serendipitous moment from someone else that will just put everything into motion. What happened was that we were invited to be with some friends at their house in Martha's Vineyard for the summer, and we'd never been up there. This was going to be cool. So we went there, and as soon as we got there, our friend said he had to go back to the city on business for 3 days, and so just the house was ours, you know, enjoy yourself. So here we are in Martha's Vineyard. We don't know anybody, you know, don't know where to go. We're in this great house, and I had nothing with me in terms of poetry because I was on vacation. I had nothing. I had all my research, all my notebooks, just one notebook with me. And because of that, because I had 3 days with nothing else to do, I started writing. And I didn't write a poem about Bridge Tower, you know, which is my main subject. I wrote a poem about Beethoven. And I realized that afterwards, only afterwards, I realized that that was what had been stopping me. The fear of Beethoven had stopped me from writing anything, because how can you presume to write about Beethoven? Well, now I say, how can anybody is game? It's fair game. So I thought what I would do is I'll read you the first poem that I ever wrote in the book. It's in the middle of the book now. And it's a poem called Vienna Spring. This is when Beethoven has just met Bridge Tower, this mixed-race violinist, and decides to go and write the sonata for him. So it's actually the terminal, the hinging point. The only thing you need to know is that there's a little bit of German in here. the word Wirtschaft, which is like a bar, and noch and Maß, Mädel means another beer. Mädel means your bartender, okay? And Beethoven is speaking. Vienna Spring. A lunatic angel has descended on Vienna. No sooner had I given up on the violin as no more than a tiny, querulous beast suited solely for dilettante monarchs and their peg-leg street beggars, did I make the acquaintance of George Holgreen Bridgetower, mulatto, musician, magician, most monstrous. After such delicious execution of an afternoon's program so decidedly pedestrian, there's nothing to be done but repair to a neighboring Wirtschaft where, noch ein Maß, Mädel, I fear I must revise my former assessment. Though dipped in ink, this Jacob has grappled the shining messenger for a glimpse of heaven and won the battle. Entirely master of his instrument, he climbs the strings, agile as the monkeys from his father's land. Ah, immortality has a new-wrought human face. How I love my handsome, brash new friend, this twilight stranger who has given me myself again. So then, why not everything, and more, and all at once? 4 strings on a chord with the silence beyond, solo and chorus, the declaimed and the whispered. All that I know, and know I am losing, have been losing, have lost. So I did start in medias res and really did not have a chronology until about 2/3 of the way through the project. My modus operandus basically was to go off on tangents all the time. And if for instance, I stumbled upon something that happened in that era, around that time, like the year that the River Thames froze over in London, then, and it froze over so solidly that they built a whole little city on the ice with booths and Punch and Judy shows and stuff like that. I went and looked up what Punch and Judy shows there were, what they did, what the recipes were, and what game Skittles was, things like that. I did not do it with intent until I was waiting for the call, and there would be a call. Somewhere there would be a word, there would be a phrase, and suddenly I was writing a poem. At the moment that I started writing the poem, I stopped reading the research, put it away. And so this went back and forth and back and forth. It took about 5 years to write. The last, I would say the last half year, 3 months were really crazed. It was in the summer, and I actually pretty much locked myself away in the house and played this sonata over and over again to my poor husband's dismay. And I also kind of cut myself off from the world because I didn't want to hear my voice. I wanted to hear their voices, and there are lots of characters in this novel. Verse novel, there are Beethoven, even Napoleon in the background, the Prince of Wales, Reels of Haydn's in there quite a bit. And there are many different voices. There's first person, some are first person Beethoven, first person Bridgetower, second person, third person, they're all over the place. And as Kevin mentioned, there's also a first novel in there. Because as I was writing this, I knew I was circling that mystery, the thing that drew me in the first place. What could have been so bad as a saucy comment that Beethoven would have flown into a rage and destroyed the dedication? What drove that? And I knew I was circling this, and I wanted to find out more and more about my characters, have them tell me what it was. And finally, I got to the point where I had a timeline. By that time, I had a map. I felt like Dr. Strangelove, right? Push pins on a map because the world was a vastly different place then. This world that they were working in was kind of amazing, which went from Hungary to England. And that's where, but they were crisscrossing all the time. And meanwhile, wars were going on along the edges and things like that. So I had all these push pins up, but that was not helping me get to that central mystery. Finally, I tried to write the poem, and I thought I had an edge. I thought that Beethoven was telling me why he was jealous of Bridgetauer. They were only 10 years apart. Bridgetauer was quite a pretty man. And believe me, I tried. I wrote several poems about that moment, but they were all insufficient to the task, interestingly enough, since I'm a poet and believe fervently that poetry is always sufficient to the task. And then I stopped and I looked around the world that these characters had been building around me. And I looked at what they were walking through, because I think that in a historical verse novel, or on any verse novel really, but in a historical verse novel, if the world does not come alive to the readers, then it's failed in some way. And I realized that the world that they were walking in at that crucial moment when he gave the saucy comment was a world of Vienna where there were very stratified societies, and yet there was also a very raunchy parody of that society happening at the bars and in the Prater and in the amusement parks. And then I thought, I need something that I wanted to do a Punch and Judy show, basically. And that's why the first play comes into the middle, which is sort of like Mad Magazine, if you remember Mad Magazine used to do those kind of to the tune of things. That also helped inform the book. It was a way of saying that we will never know that mystery, so we're going to play around with it. And so it was also a way to move out of the interior lives of these characters, because in many of these poems, as that one poem, Be in a Spring, kind of gives you an inkling of, many of the poems do come out of the interior of each of its the character, and then reflect on the plot as we know it. But to then pull out and to do the first play in the middle of that was a way of making the voices come really alive, because they had to speak. They would, but at the same time, telling you you're never really going to know. These people are going to be concealing things all the time. So that was really fun to do. I think Kevin had asked us, what do you think the verse novel achieves that the prose novel does not? And I do think that pacing is really crucial, but it's also a willingness on the reader's part to suspend all of the details that they get as the narrative continues, and to exist in the moment even when the moment moves into the next moment. There's the weight and the heft of each word, the weight of the sentence, the weight of the line, the weight of the stanzas in between, in this white space in between each poem. All of that is a kind of an interesting weight that is different than a prose novel. It's a heightened attention to sound and a deeper allegiance, I think, to silence. So, otherwise, I think that that's enough for now. I would like to just say, someone's asked me if I'd ever write another one, and I'd say, no, never, never. But then, of course, one should never say never. I resisted this one for a long time for many reasons. One of them was because I thought that I knew it was going to be a long project. And I knew that it was also very male. There are very few female characters in the book. And I got wretchedly lonely at certain points and would run out of my room and say to my husband, you guys are all assholes. Because I had to think like them. And in the 18th century there were a lot. But also because afterwards, it was a wonderful feeling to be carried by the world, by that world, and that music. And I'm not only talking about music, but language as music. But afterwards, the feeling of loss was so deep. I was bereft. I was literally, really, utterly bereft for months afterwards. I felt like I had lost some of my best friends in a place where I could feel at home. And that's a hard thing to get over. With every poem you feel bereft, but after that it was pretty major. And I must say, in terms of publishing history, I was really lucky that my editor, Carol Smith at Norton, was infinitely patient. She didn't ask me what I was working on. I didn't tell anybody what I was working on for a year. I didn't publish any poems in magazines for about a year and a half because I didn't want them to. I couldn't let it go. I had to be in that world completely. And I simply said, I'm working on something. She goes, okay, all right. And she waited. And that kind of trust gave me more courage than anything else. So I'm going to end there and let Kevin take over.
Kevin Young.
Afternoon, or is it evening? Evening. Wonderful to be here, and what an honor to be here with following. Well, it's so terrifying, but wonderful to follow you two wonderful writers. I'm just going to talk sort of generally about the first novel, and I was taking so many notes, some of them may come out. I was thinking, when Kevin was talking, that all verse novels are long poems, but not all long poems are verse novels. Having written long poems that felt very different than Black Mariah did, I guess for some reason, excuse me, the verse novel seems to me, hearing both you talk about your process, but also the knowing the books themselves, they're not necessarily linear, but musical. And while there are certainly non-linear novels, I think that the verse novel form somehow suits that feeling. I also was taking notes because Thomas and Beulah, a book dear to my heart that helped me learn how to write, I never thought of it as a verse novel until today, so that was really interesting. I've thought of it as a long poem always, but I think some of its amazing qualities, I can see how they translate, and I'd love to think about that more. My novel, Black Mariah, I'm calling it a verse novel today, but I didn't call it that on the book. I had thought about it for a while, and I think editors like hearing you writing a verse novel, at least mine, or publishing houses, not my editors specifically, like, as, you know, it's sort of like, I'm writing I don't know, a disco franchise McDonald's poem. So that it just wasn't, it was like a strange beast, even though there's the memory, I think, for most people of Autobiography of Red, which is a terrific verse novel, and had appeared not too long ago. Black Mariah actually started with a line, which is still the first lines of the book. Snake oil sales were slow. And this idea of this voice just came to me, and it was sort of this, I would call him a soft-boiled detective, talking about his woes, his life, his love. And it was really a kind of blues detective. And in fact, later I realized there was a book called Blues Detective about the African-American detective. Pretty soon after that, I had 2 or 3 poems, but they were really actually always part of another sequence that came before it called Jelly Roll of Blues. So they were embedded in Jelly Roll for the longest time. There were these sort of just moments when suddenly a detective would talk in the middle of this blues book. In retrospect, it seems really strange that it was like that, and pulling it apart felt very natural after, but it was very hard to get to that point. And I say that because I think some of the thinking about writing about the verse novel is thinking also about its form. Some of the development of it, the development of the form, is also the form of development that the verse novel goes through. And for me, it was really saying, well, okay, this voice is independent from this blues eye that I had crafted in Jelly Roll, which was intimate and playful in ways that I hoped Black Mariah would be, but it was also very personal and about love, and there was a you, but the you was never named. And as soon as I pulled it apart, you know, I had a chunk of poems excuse me, maybe a dozen, maybe two, and I thought, oh wow, suddenly it's a book, and suddenly it's, you know, and if that book is a verse novel, then suddenly that's what it is. I also realized that there were two voices in the book, and I'll read you some of the detective's voice. And in this poem, it's not the first poem I wrote, but it's one where he tells you his name and a little bit about himself. It's called The Alias. Bruised like gin, stirred too quick, ruining the tonic, I stumbled home, put on a steak eye patch, and fixed me another drink, hoping this one would take the way she never did. On the rocks and stiff, all's I got left, a key to a safe deposit that's empty, and one lousy alias, SOS Malone. My real name's AKA Jones. Leastwise, that's what I've been told. Hey buddy, welcome home. Murphy bed like a booby trap, springs shot. My mattress thin as the bills I once stuffed it with. I drink a lot about my thinking problem. Nightcap, noontime nip, she my unquit habit. This roof with more leaks than I could ever fix. Buckets of rusty rainwater I bend low to drink. Brimming over, my good eye watched all night the storm drown the street in worms. So that voice came fairly, I don't know if easily, but quickly, and was always talking to me throughout this. And one other thing, I think when it went from becoming, like I said, something of a book, or the starts of a book, to a verse novel, is when other characters appeared. And I was thinking about that when Rita was mentioning the characters, and lots of characters in the verse play in her book. Because I think that's one characteristic of the verse novel, is it isn't like the sonnet sequence, which was, of course, the predecessor to the novel in a way, the first novel. It's an I and usually a you. There's usually not a third person, or someone could disagree with me wildly, please do. But that's how I think of it. And even the blues, I thought of this I and you. And so something about having suddenly this other voice for me, and it was a woman in the book named Delilah Redbone, and not her real name. But there's all these aliases, as you can tell from that previous poem, and once she started talking, and she was tougher and more interesting, really, than AKA Jones, who I was really fascinated with her. She was really the one who I decided had to have the last word in the book, and has it. And I'll read you one quick poem from her in a moment. I had written these other sequences, of course. To Repel Ghosts was what I thought of as a double album, and the moment I thought of it, was like a mess of poems, and then suddenly I said, oh, it's a double album, and then it was a book. And working with that framework, this one, though it was a film noir, it was so, to me, different. It did have a narrative, but it didn't necessarily have a plot, or it had a story, but not a plot. One of the difficulties, I think, of the verse novel is staginess, which is to say, people come on in poems and they say things and then they leave. But film noir, as a form, is so stagey, stock, there's full of patter, and it really allowed me sometimes to pull that camera back and show you the set, and show you that this was all, happening, but also scripted and stock. And that was another sort of, perhaps the sort of last moment, is a friend of mine who read it and had encouraged me to pull it apart. He said, well, you gotta have like the mob boss in there, and you gotta have, and I was like, oh wow, so it was really when I had the Gunsel, the Mooch, all these kind of characters who started coming, and they were seen through the eyes of one or the other, of either A.K. Jones or Delilah Redbone, but they were always there, sort of lurking around the edges. And I thought that was when that cast of characters came to life. And they were stock characters. They were sort of nameless. They were titles, but they also had this real pull and undertow on the book. There's also some other kinds of titles. There's like a Western, there was a sci-fi poem which I had written in a moleskin notebook where I put my name on the front and lost it on a plane. And it came back to me maybe a year later. Someone sent, and I think I thanked them in the book, where they sent to me, it's like, you know, we found this, one of the flight attendants had it, and we're sending it to you, you know. What? I had sort of given up on this sci-fi poem, you know, you know, suddenly I was like, well, now I have to put it in there. I mean, the book was almost done. So, you know, people sometimes ask me, why is that weird science fiction poem, or like suddenly there's, you know, and I thought of it as kind of like there's a movie set, and sometimes they're mostly making film noir, but sometimes they have to make a crappy, you know, monster movie, and that's what happens. And I was thinking about also this staginess as an advantage, and I love thinking about the verse play or the drama of the classroom, these places that dramas can happen, and what it means to then, within your novel, actually stage something. And I thought that's always an interesting moment for me. And this last poem I'll read, and then we can open it up if you like, is about Delilah's voice, and sort of over the course of the book, which, like I said, it has kind of a story and a plot, but the story you already know, boy, girl, they meet, they, try to kill each other in different ways. This is the moment in the book, and I stopped thinking of it as it has a plot, like I said, but it has kind of this atmosphere. And this is the moment where Delilah has realized that the man next to her, who we don't quite know, is it the mob boss or is it AKA, is no good for her. The other thing I'll say real quick is that, thinking of staginess, is a few years after the book was out, the Providence Black Repertory Theater called me up and said, hey, we want to do this as a play. And I thought, what? And so it was an amazing experience to hear your words, which I'd written as poems. They didn't alter any of the words, though they didn't use every poem in the book. So they would read your whole poem, and some of them are 10 minutes long. And what I had never thought of, even though it sounds very obvious, is that some of the poems, even though they're in, I think of them as two voices. They've staged them as multiple voices. So sometimes that was amazing. So I think that quality, that polyphonic quality, sometimes is in the verse novel in ways that I'm not sure if you adapted a novel, you would think of it in the same way. So this is called Midnight Ramble. Midnight Rambles are midnight films, and in this case, usually they were segregated, and she's leaving the theater. Midnight Ramble. Leaving the coffin-cold theater in winter, single-barrel moon aimed above us, he escorted and told me lies I wanted to warm my ears. The moon's lazy eye razored shut. The two of us fought that hawk, walking through wind across a world that once seemed so flat, I feared I could fall off. Now, Claire, that's her real name, every horizon got another behind it. At least that's what Mama would say. Just you wait. But I hightailed it north and changed my name. Beneath the shrapnel sky, I wanted to run from here to the train and buy me a ticket one way. I'm tired of eviction. The radio, same station, playing woe and blues. Said, tired of eviction. The radio, same station, arguing whose man is whose. I want some diesel bound south, making all stops. No more neighbors whooping cough. No more leaky solos from the faucets or landlords who pinch, swapping winks for late rent. Graveyard, shift moon that turns men mad. Let me trade fire escape for front porch. Let me ride sunset down to where train's the only whistle and a girl don't got to cry to keep herself company. Where moonshine ain't just sky and you can catch catfish sure as a man, bearded, polite, already fixed up and fried. Thank you.
So I'd like to, before we open it up to questions and answers, just like to say two things. First, Jonathan Galassi was supposed to be here, and he's written a great book that's like a verse novel called Left-Handed. He's the president of Knopf, and oddly enough, he had a meeting that he knew was happening, and he got a hold of me in advance and said, listen, I won't be able to make it. And he sent his regrets. And then I immediately that day contacted Andrew Hudgens, who wrote After the Long War, and he said, yes, I can be there. And then there were very serious family issues in Los Angeles, and he had to change his flight, and he's out here. Why did I bring this together? I was so interested in this subject because I'm probably 80% through a verse novel now called Magdalene in Ecstasy. It takes place in 3 different countries. It's about a woman and the 2 men she's been in love with, and those are the 3 narrators. And I'm very, very excited about it, and also sometimes frustrated by this. So I thought maybe we would have questions from you, and I think these microphones are working, right? I think, yeah, they're working. So I'll point to anybody if you have a question. So somebody over here.
I had a question for Kevin Young. I was just curious if any of the plays were set to music.
Any of the, yeah. Were any of the poems in my book set to music? There was some singing. I'm not sure if they were set, you know, they were arranged, certainly. As you can tell, there was some blues there happening, and I really wanted this kind of blues undertow and this almost rolling blues rhythm. I had written this previous blues book, Jelly Roll, and I thought that as the country blues, and I thought of Black Mariah as the city blues, even though you can tell in that last poem she's yearning for the country, as many country blues do, city blues do. So there was that quality that I think they captured, sometimes through singing, sometimes through these many voices at once. Yeah, so there was this musical quality in that production, but I don't know exactly how it was set or how much.
Okay.
Hi, so thank you very much for your very different ideas about this form, and I was curious, in Kevin Young's presentation, it was clear that there are multiple characters who speak in their own voices. In Rita Dove's, it sounds like that's also true. Wendy, I wanted to ask you, in yours, which is, we're calling it a verse novel, you said it's very memoristic. I was curious if there are multiple speakers in that, or if it's all in the first person I, and if you could just talk a little bit about how it ended up.
It's all in the first person, but through that first person lens, if you will, there are a number of characters who also speak. So the I in the book is recalling various characters and using their language. But it's all through her eyes, if that answers the question.
Yeah, I was just curious.
Yeah.
Oh, there's somebody in the back here. Yes, with the hand.
I had a question, and I would love if all the panelists could chime in on this. When you have a verse novel and you have multiple narrators for your different poems, do you find that there's a need to differentiate within the poem who is speaking or not? So if you had, let's say...
No, it's a great question.
Okay.
I was just thinking about it.
Well, why don't you start?
Oh, no, I won't.
Let me see. Yeah, I was thinking about it too, because what you're saying too is that if, say, first person is, in my case, Bridge Tower, how do I differentiate that Beethoven is that's speaking within that poem? And I discovered that, first of all, they have different tonalities. They do speak differently. They have different rhythms. They use different, some use ions, some use more dactylics. That was more, I didn't think that out beforehand and charted, but it was a matter of feel. And it's, you solve the problems with some of the same techniques that I think novelists use to solve the problem of who is speaking where. So, yeah, that's an interesting question, yeah. Who's going next?
Well, there's the red and blue ink I used. No, I think it's a great question, because for me, I actually almost ended up, wanting them to be different, but not wanting you necessarily when you started the poem to know which one was speaking. I wanted to, I didn't want there to be, in my case, especially because there was this sort of relationship that either happened or did, there's different versions. I didn't want there to be like a masculine voice and a feminine voice. They were both tough, and she was tougher than him in a way. And sometimes the poem would start and you wouldn't necessarily know who was speaking. And that was part of the pleasure, I hoped, of let's call them a voiceover of the, excuse me, of the book. And I love the fact in like film noir, for instance, you don't even know sometimes if they're alive or dead when the voiceover. So there was always that there, he was like, well, I can go as wild as I want because I know this person might not even make it to the end of this book. And so that was the kind of, there was a real pleasure in that. That was very different, say, than my previous book about Jean-Michel Basquiat. He was dead the whole time, in that book. And sometimes he was more dead. And sometimes, when I finished it, I gave a reading, and I was at Writers' Colony, and I typed up a little thing on a physical typewriter, and it said, we're going to perform an exorcism, because I've been so haunted by him. And this didn't have that feeling. It was much more, here are these characters that I'm getting to know, and they're getting to know me, and they're getting to know each other, and sometimes they speak alike, and sometimes they, speak alike to a point where then they diverge so greatly that you're like, oh, well, of course. And I like that pleasure and suspense, let's call it.
If I could just say, I hope you'll see my verse novel within, the next 20 years. But Wendy is my best editor, and she's seen the poems from the very beginning, and she said right away, you need to distinguish these people. And so I actually named them at the top of each poem, and then they have different forms. Each one, one has quatrains, one has tercets, the other is kind of free verse columns. So that's one of the ways I was doing it. Okay, another question? Tina? Oh, Wendy, I'm sorry.
Just real quickly to add to that, and not only are they different forms, but I mean, the diction is completely different. Yeah. Completely different diction in those three voices. And just back to your question earlier that kind of leads into this wonderful subject, with Nothing Between Us, one of the things I realize now, because of this discussion, I'm realizing I was playing with this, I was recalling the different speech patterns of so many of the people around me, and was really trying to reproduce each character's, even though it was through the lens of the first person, trying to reproduce exactly the dialogue or the dialect of that character. Yeah.
I'm just curious about the label of verse novel versus verse memoir. In your case, why not call it a verse memoir or Thomas and Beulah?
The question, if you couldn't hear it, was what's the difference really between these two terms, verse novel and verse memoir?
Well, I think that Wendy really should speak to this, but in terms of Thomas and Beulah, it was not completely true, first of all. It was an exploration back into the past. I changed names and even changed the entire constellation of the family. I made, instead of, I changed birth dates, made one of them younger than the other, things like that. Because the truth, the bare facts in that book were not what was important. What was important was the truth of the memory, let's put it that way, to get the essence of them. So it would have been, I think, disingenuous to call it a verse memoir or to even think of it in terms of that. And even in terms of, it's not allowed to call it a verse biography is not right either. It's I think that what I tried to do is also fracture what we knew about it, fracture what we knew about the facts, so that you realize that in the end everything is fiction. Even the recollection of something, is a fiction. Once we acknowledge the fact that we've got this artifice around us, then we can get to work to really get a sense of it. So that's what.
I think the great thing about a poem is true and not true. And so what I love about a poem that, I don't think you have to necessarily worry about that in a poem, that we don't have nonfiction poems and fiction poems necessarily. To me, the novel part of it is like a nonfiction novel, which is that it refers to the form, not necessarily the truth or the non-truth of it, if you know what I mean. I've been thinking about this too much in my next book. But I think it's a great question, because I think the novel part is that structure to me, is that sense of narrative that Capote, just to take it out of verse, is trying to get into nonfiction. That said, he had asked about, you had asked Kevin about Ardency, my latest book, and that book I think of not as a novel because it's an epic. And I think, I'm about reclaiming things. Why not the epic? Which never really left us, but I think of Pound's definition, an epic is a poem containing history. And if you start with that, it isn't a novel in that sense that, except I'm trying to imagine some voices that, that I'm making up the voice part. But in that poem, it was so important to me to have the facts be exactly how they happened, to have the history part right. And any suggestion otherwise would really trouble me, I think. That because of exactly what I was saying before, because the novel part would imply liberties, like the film Amistad, for instance, which I didn't see till much after I finished it, and much after I had started it 20 years ago, is, they take liberties, they make up that Morgan Freeman character. And that's how they knew actually that it was not plagiarized, but that it had this original suit, is because that character did not exist in history, and it existed in a novelization of the story. And so then suddenly Spielberg had to explain why this character. And that's just because they had a series of writers, and it wasn't Spielberg's fault. All that's to say, I think that's a great question, and I hope Wendy has a better, more focused answer.
No, nothing better and nothing more focused.
Was it more emotionally freeing?
Briefly, I started out writing it really from memory. As I said, it was a sort of an explosion of something I'd locked away. The love story is really pretty much memoir. But gradually, as I began to see poems building, I did begin to fictionalize. I began to see it as a book, as a series, and began, as I said, to combine characters. And I made up things. For instance, in Nothing Between Us, the husband is an orchestra teacher. In real life, the husband was a choral director. Not much of a change, but changes like that, and I began to see it, began to make changes like that, and characters were combined. And then later, as we got close to publication, a couple of people said, "You've got to call this a novel, or you're going to be in trouble."
I was wondering about that.
So actually, that's why it's called a novel in prose poems. She says cowardly-ish. Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid, I know there's people who like to ask more questions, but I'm afraid we are exactly out of time here. So, if anybody would like to come up and say hi and ask any more questions, that would be great. And Wendy's book is here to sell and sign. And thank you, everybody. Thanks so much.